The following is a presentation of Geekster Media.
Remember that show back then? Remember that show? Turn on the TV, time was always flying. Why did they have to end? So many shows you forgotten. Now that we've got a podcast, we can release all the shows from our hands. Yeah, will you be the most TV dudes you'll ever listen to? As long as we keep on talking sitcoms and cartoons from back in the day. Okay, we confess, we're obsessed, but we got a podcast to help you remember that show.
Hey there, TV lovers, and welcome to episode 10 of Remember That Show, the podcast where we revisit the obscure or forgotten TV shows of the 80s and 90s. I'm William Bruce West.
And I'm Adam Pope.
Sometimes we even cover pilots that never became full series, and that's the case today.
Well, we've talked about a few animated relics on the show in the past, which I feel like earned less than stellar reviews. But today I think we'll be a little bit more excited as we discuss a Marvel animation project that was just a little ahead of its time, perhaps. Especially, we're all excited now about the release of X-Men 97 on Disney+, which I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit as well. But before we get into our pilot for this episode, we got to jump back into our personal television watching histories in a segment we call Theme Song. So before they were the entertainment powerhouse of the 21st century, as you well know, publishing comics is kind of hard. It goes up and down. And Marvel Comics kept themselves afloat financially throughout the 70s and 80s by helping to develop comic books and animated series based on new toys that were coming to market, as well as publishing adaptations of TV shows and movies and cartoon series. Some of the most popular examples for toys were Transformers and G.I. Joe, which Marvel was very, very involved in creating the lore for. Meanwhile, Star Wars was a very popular movie adaptation that really kept them out of the red for a while. Now, we're both kind of, amateur pop culture historians. We love looking back. So is there a more obscure toy, movie, TV show that you recall getting a Marvel comic?
That one's tough because honestly, when it comes to the most obscure one, that was actually kind of recent. Because if we talk about the 80s and 90s, everything got a comic. Not just to stick with Marvel, but I mean Cops, Central Organization of Police Specialists, or Cyber Cops. It got an adaptation. If it was a cartoon, it at least got 4 issues. So it's really hard there, but I find that recently there are things that just catch me off guard. So a few years ago, about 6 years ago at this point, I kicked myself for passing on it. The pop musician artist The Weeknd, he has this alter ego, or at least he did at one time, Starboy. Now he's just kind of this weird beat up guy who's going to haunted strip clubs and stuff like that. That was something somebody said on Twitter, so I don't want to steal that. I'm giving credit where it's due. The Weeknd makes music that you would hear in a haunted strip club. Well, Marvel did a comic called The Weeknd Presents Starboy, and I remember seeing it on stands, and I was like, this is dumb. Why does he have a comic? This is just some kind of weird alter ego thing. Because there was a period of time where celebrities did that. I remember when I worked at Diamond, Stephen Colbert had this thing called Tech Jansen, who is this Buck Rogers space cadet kind of thing. And Oni Press did a miniseries for it. So I thought this was just one of those celebrity vanity project things, but it's a one-shot comic and it goes for a lot of money now. And later I became a fan of The Weeknd. So now it's almost like a grail item for me, but that's the one that always comes to mind of how did this happen? He's not the guy in Black Eyed Peas where we know he likes toys and comics. It just seemed to come out of nowhere. fair. But like, how about you? What comes to mind for you?
It's interesting to your point, like you said, it just felt like everybody got a comic, whether it was like Visionaries or like Air Raiders or like just all these weird toys that would come out. The one that stands out for me, just because it was not a popular toy line, but I've picked up a few issues over the years, was this thing called Animax. And most people, they think about it, they're like, I don't know what Animax is, but it is this bizarre kind of like vehicle-based toy line, but it also had like, animal warriors in armor type things. So that's one that stands out for me. But as far as like TV adaptations, like one of my first comics was an Alf comic. Like I always thought that was wild, but also a TV show that we got to talk about sometime down the line, which was Sledgehammer. If you remember that TV show, which is just a gem of 80s television, but he got a comic book and like Satana appears in it. It's like in the Marvel Universe proper somehow. I think Spider-Man shows up, or at least like some like little cameo. Like they were always doing weird things like that. Even, in the 90s, Meteor Man got a comic. It's like this film that did okay, but wasn't huge. And then all of a sudden now Robert Townsend is in the Marvel Universe because Meteor Man was literally like teaming up with Spider-Man and people like that. So yeah, there's a lot of things that would just kind of come out of nowhere. You're like, I cannot believe that has been adapted. Did you have anyone you wanted to add in there?
Well, definitely, because like at first we were talking about like adaptations, but then you start talking about like crossovers, which is kind of like a different situation that brings to mind, like to me, the strangest crossover, and there's a lot of strange ones, honestly, but the one that always sticks out in my head is the Marvel team up with Spider-Man and the Not Ready for Primetime Players, because it's just so like, why is Spider-Man hanging out with the cast of Saturday Night Live? Like we take for granted we live in this time where we just like kind of crap on it. It's like The Simpsons, like, oh, it's not funny anymore. But like, this is when it was the thing, and hanging out with Spider-Man. I don't know. I don't have that issue, but that's one I've always wanted to track down. Just the cover is just strange to me.
And the Avengers, I think, had a crossover with David Letterman on his show in their comic. Yeah. So we got to check out how this particular series got the green light.
Marvel Comics jumped into the world of animation starting just a few years after their universe was created. In 1968, Spider-Man had been adapted as a cartoon with a very memorable theme song. But just 2 years prior, other Marvel heroes like Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, and others also got their time in the spotlight with barely animated segments pulled from comics panels on the Marvel Superhero Show. The Fantastic Four also had many iterations of their own animated adventures throughout the 60s and 70s, with The Thing even getting his own bizarre spin-off cartoon starring a team named Benji Grimm, who smashed his Thing rings together to become the Rocky Orange Hero. Adam, even though they were before our time, did you watch any of these early Marvel animated series?
Somehow I did. We grew up in the time of reruns. It feels like you don't see that as often anymore, like where it's reruns from like 40 years prior. And I'm just not watching as much like satellite TV, and maybe that's where it all is in a way. But like the Spider-Man cartoon from the 60s would just play on weekday afternoons in my area on our local Fox affiliate. Like I have videotapes where I recorded, parts of episodes. And like that Marvel superhero show, like I definitely saw that like some Sunday morning when they needed to fill space and they plopped in, Captain America, and he's just like tilting slightly and that's it, like as far as he would go, moving his arm and the shield flies out of frame or something. Even the Fantastic Four, same, like I knew who Herbie the Robot was because it was playing. The only one, that weird Benji Grimm thing, I found out about that by buying a random animation magazine back in the day because it had Beavis and Butthead on the cover. And then I got all this history about animation and it had an article about that show. It was like half Flintstones, like Fred and Barney. And it was called Fred and Barney Meet the Thing, even though they never actually crossed over. So it was Fred and Barney had a little segment, and then the second one was The Thing. And it was so strange. And then I remember tracking it down once, YouTube became a thing. And I was just like, I can't believe it. But did you catch up with these older Marvel cartoons as a kid?
Yeah, there weren't a lot of kids in my neighborhood growing up, but like my next door neighbor was a lot younger than me, and he always kind of like looked up to me because of the age difference. I remember when I was 11, he was 7, and he was always like, oh, 7-Eleven. So like his dad was really into pop culture in the like sci-fi kind of set, you know? I remember he had the very first like Mego doll I had ever seen, and it was Spock. And I'm one of those kids, like looking back on it is terrible, but like if I came to your house, I probably begged you for something. Like I didn't want to leave empty-handed. So like over the years, I was always trying to get that Mego doll because I was like an entry-level Trekkie at that point, and it was always like, no, it's my dad's. But the reason I bring this up, they're also the only people I ever knew to have Betamax, and they like one of the only tapes they had was the Betamax of How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. And I remember even before I knew comics and knew like the political aspect of things, his dad had told him how like Stan Lee always like stole credit for things, and like how like John Buscema was really doing all the work, and Stan shouldn't have even been on that video because he's not an artist and things like that. And I feel like on that tape, they also had those old Marvel superhero shows episodes, which like we look back and we're like, oh, those are so crappy or whatever. But comics basically brought that back just like 20 years ago with motion comics.
Yes.
You know, like it was at first they would sell you this new technology called a CD-ROM, and they had like motion comics on there where there's kind of animated panels. But then as like internet got faster, they started doing it online. And I mean, Marvel still does it occasionally when they make quote unquote trailers for their big events. So like that started a trend that like is still followed up on today.
Yeah, and bringing up the videotapes too, like that was a big thing. Like you would go to the video store and they had Marvel animation videos that you could rent, so you could catch up with a lot of the older stuff that way as well. But by the early 80s, you know, the Incredible Hulk had received his own cartoon, likely due to the popularity of the live action TV series that was starring Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby. It had just ended its run in 82. Then the animated series starts. Spider-Man, he had both a solo series and a slightly more popular revamp that everybody knows called Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. They found him teamed with Iceman and a new superheroine named Firestar and a dog. You gotta love Miss Lion. But speaking of female superheroes, the Jessica Drew original incarnation of Spider-Woman also had her own solo animated series in 1979, on which Spider-Man himself made a few crossover appearances. So it just makes sense that with such a strong pedigree in the cartoon space that by 1988, you know, Marvel's going to start developing, wanting to adapt their highest selling comic book, The Uncanny X-Men. So of all these 80s Marvel shows, which did you experience firsthand?
None of them. Like looking back, it's really weird because like I can probably argue and discuss more about Marvel, but I always say like at the end of the day, I'm a DC person. Like in my reckless 20s where I considered a tattoo, I was gonna get the Whitman variant of the DC Bullet. There's like the Whitman variant covers where like in certain parts of the country, they were the distributor. So you got like a W instead of the DC. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna get that on my shoulder and I'm gonna be so awesome. And I never did it, and I'm so glad I didn't. But like, I'm a DC guy, so I grew up with like superpowers and all that stuff. I saw none of these. I have 2 experiences with these. It was either The Incredible Hulk, because I remember our local Errol's Video, that was before Blockbuster, this is when we had the mom and pops, they were going out of business and selling their inventory. So my mom bought me a tape of The Incredible Hulk cartoon. So I had that for like years. I don't even like the Hulk. That was just in my age of like, I begged a lot. Like I said, I'd come to your house and want to leave with something. If I went in a store, I wanted to leave with something. So I ended up with that. I don't remember loving it too much. But in that era, Spider-Man to me was always the guy who landed on the logo after Muppet Babies.
Yes.
And I never understood the connection there. You know, I was always like, why is Spider-Man here? Like, is he friends with the Muppets? Like, what's that about? You know? So none of these. Like, Spider-Woman cartoon, that's news to me. Spider Spider-Man and his amazing friends, like looking at it through a 2024 lens is kind of like they were just trying to like ease us into accepting mutants, and they used Spider-Man as their foot in the door, you know? Like,
Well, that's true. Like, and now I was watching all of these. Like, they weren't first run because I was born in '82. So, like, Spider-Man, even just the solo Spider-Man series, I still have it actually back on my shelf. One of these like crank handle things where it was a viewer that you put a cartridge in, and then it would basically play an animated film for you without sound. And so I had like an episode of Spider-Man on that I could watch. And then Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, I was so into it. Like, I remember buying the Marvel Action Universe comic book because the Spider Friends were on the cover together. And I was just like, oh, it's an actual comic now. Even though obviously the character's based on comic book characters, but I was like, this is great. And then the Spider-Woman show, that was one that I had recorded. That was part of the Sunday morning cartoons block in my area. So they would play those. I had this one where it's Spider-Woman and Spider-Man fighting space mummies that were flying in on pyramid-shaped, spaceships. And I was just like, this is amazing, because I didn't know Spider-Woman was a thing from the comics, right? I just saw there's a Spider-Woman now. So like all of these, including what we're going to talk about here, like X-Men were not a thing that I had any concept of, and then suddenly they appeared in animation.
well, I guess it's finally time to examine the pilot itself. So allow us to give the elevator pitch. Pryde of the X-Men was a 1989 animated pilot created by Marvel Productions and Toei Animation. It was produced by Rick Hoberg, Larry Houston, and Will Mignot, and executive produced by Margaret Lesh, who all had a long history in TV animation and may sound familiar to fans of the 1992 Fox X-Men series. Though the pilot did not manage to be sold as a series to any network, it was aired as part of the Marvel Action Universe syndicated television package, which other Marvel shows like Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, Dino Riders, and even the RoboCop cartoon would be shown. The pilot features a team based on the 70s and 80s incarnation of the team that included Professor X, Cyclops, Storm, Colossus, Wolverine, Dazzler, Nightcrawler, and the newest member, a teenage mutant named Kitty Pryde, from whom the pilot takes its name. The pilot was eventually released on VHS and was even adapted into a photo comic special in 1990, using stills from the pilot with word balloons added to present the dialogue.
Now, the plot to this pilot involves Magneto being broken out of a traveling military prison by the White Queen to join with the other members of his Brotherhood of Mutant Terrorists, not evil mutants at this point, which included the Blob, Pyro, Juggernaut, and Toad. Now, Magneto plans to redirect a comet onto a collision course with the Earth to plunge the world into a new ice age, after which mutants will be the dominant species. But in order to do this, he needs to steal the mutant power circuit from the X-Men's computer Cerebro, located at Xavier's school. Meanwhile, a potential new student there, 14-year-old Kitty Pryde, arrives at Xavier's school and is introduced to the other mutants, who are assembled as a team called the X-Men. Each were born with the ability to manifest unique powers, like Kitty herself, who can become immaterial and phase through solid objects. So Magneto and Juggernaut attack the mansion. They obtain the mutant power circuit from Kitty after Professor X tells her she has to take care of it. And then the X-Men had already left to stop the Blob and Pyro from getting the coordinates of the comet that Magneto could use to redirect it. So the X-Men then decide, well, he's got the circuit and we're going to follow him to a satellite sanctuary called Asteroid M that is orbiting Earth. So donning spacesuits and flying their Blackbird jet into outer space, the team battles Magneto's henchmen and interrupt Magneto himself from redirecting the comet towards Earth, but Nightcrawler is presumed to have sacrificed himself in the conflict when the comet struck Asteroid him instead. So after mourning their brave teammate, it's revealed that Nightcrawler teleported himself into a locker aboard the Blackbird at the last minute. As the team celebrates, they welcome Kitty as an X-Man in training. So that's the basic story there. Will, I am curious, before we get into our cheers and jeers, had you seen this prior to preparing for this? Like, where did you interact with this pilot for the first time?
Oh yeah, going all the way back, like we're talking Errol's Video in the Maryland, DC, Virginia area. I rented Pryde of the X-Men when it came out. Like, we would go and my mom would rent whatever she wanted and I would beg and get whatever I wanted. I rented it when it came out and I hated it. I hated it my whole life. I hated it then because I had no connection to the X-Men. I don't discover the X-Men comic till about 92, like around the time the ongoing regular cartoon starts. So like, we knew Wolverine, like, you know, he's a guy with claws, and we knew Cyclops because he's the guy who shoots lasers out of his eyes, but they're not lasers, but we didn't know better. You know, it's one of those deals. So like, the visuals were there. You'd see them in like the Sears catalog from the Secret Wars toys, but other than that, I had no real connection to it. So then, like, I was like, okay, whatever. There were no more. Like, I would vacillate between it and G.I. Joe the movie a lot. So then, like, years later, when I get into comics and everything, I try it again. And the thing that stuck with me all that time was Wolverine is not Australian. Like, to me, that tanks the whole thing, the whole enterprise. And honestly, that was my stance until revisiting it here. And it's a good pilot. I said this a lot when we were doing those like Halloween shows. It is a show of its time. It fits right in with the like late 80s toyetic show. It would be like Centurions or like Mask or one of those things. So I've dropped in on it several times in my life, but only now do I appreciate it. How about you?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I definitely was watching this syndicated Marvel Action Universe thing, and I remember when it just popped up one morning, and I was like, X-Men, interesting, you know, because I had just gotten into comics like in 1988. Like, I bought my first comics like Excalibur. That Excalibur issue, I had a bunch of different characters, including Kitty Pryde, who was now Shadowcat, and like, so it was like X-Men adjacent. It had Nightcrawler. He became my favorite character immediately from there. And so I was like, he's in a cartoon now. I can't believe it. I was watching it there, and then it got replayed a few times, but it wasn't, you know, in constant rotation. And then years later, I remember seeing it, on a video store shelf, and I was like, oh, there it is. I'm going to check it out again. And then I remember there was the Nintendo game that was X-Men that had great art, and I was like, oh, this is awesome. And I remember how terrible it was. And then there was the X-Men arcade game, which was obviously based on this pilot. And so it kept popping up again. I even was able to go through back issue bins over the years, searching for old comics, pick up a couple issues of Marvel Age magazine, which then started filling in the gaps in the information, because Marvel Age was this comic book sized magazine that was like a promotional tool that Marvel would put out every month to say, these are the new comics coming out, and here's like some behind the scenes interviews or whatever, just things to get you excited. And so of course they were excited about this. So I always knew about it. I always wondered what if, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but what an interesting production. And then, you know, we got the 90s show. They have their strengths and weaknesses. So, you know, we can discuss that, but let's get into what we find so fascinating and interesting about this particular pilot in our cheers. All right, so Will, you got started early. You said it's a good pilot, but like, what do you think is the great strength that it offers?
I mean, there's a lot of exposition. You really get a download as to what they're about, which is helpful if you're not familiar with the franchise. And I mean, I have said that there are very few jump-on points for X-Men over the past, say, 30 years. So it's one of the best primers I've ever encountered for like what they're about, who they are, that kind of thing. I like the tone. Like, I think the first dialogue you hear is the guy going, mutants, I hate them. And that just like sets the tone, you know? It's really like, oh, these humans are kind of some bigots, huh? But like, the animation is good. It's familiar. Like, even though they use Toei, it looks like Sunbow. It looks like G.I. Joe.
Yeah.
And I mean, it doesn't hurt or help that like a lot of the same voice cast is there. You've got Neil Ross. You've got Michael Bell. They did their homework on like, what do you need for a successful cartoon in 1989? You know, it's one of those shows kind of like She's With Me, where like I know it was like behind the scenes stuff as financial issues, but there's no reason this show didn't get made. My biggest gripe as far as potentially weekday strip cartoon in 1989 would go is Wolverine being Australian. You know, like other than that, like it's good to go. It's good bare bones X-Men without a lot of baggage, which you can't say too often.
Definitely. And it's one of those situations where, like you hinted at earlier, the X-Men had actually appeared on Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends a couple times, you know, so they were trying to say, this is what the X-Men are. This is what a mutant is, you know, and Firestar ends up, oh, she's a mutant. You know, Iceman, oh, he's a mutant. And this is the team they came from. So you kind of had that introduction there. But when you get to this, like you say, so efficiently, there's action happening, but they're going to explain a few things along the way. And yeah, like you can get a little talky here and there, but each character is so distinct that you really can like tell each of them apart, whether it's villains or the heroes, whether it's an accent, whether it's just an attitude, you know, like Kitty Pryde, she's a whiny 14-year-old, but then Professor X, you know, he definitely sounds very wise. Nobody seems miscast, even Wolverine having an Australian accent, which it's said that Rick Hoberg, one of the producers, said, we literally made that decision. Australian invasion was happening, Crocodile Dundee. It was a big hit, and we just decided this is going to tie into that. I was like, but you already have Pyro. He's got an Australian accent. But what I thought was kind of cool was the animation, getting back to what you were saying there, it's solid. Now, I wonder if that level of animation would have continued throughout an ongoing series, if they could have kept that up. So when you have a pilot, you have more time to work on that. But especially when you think of what came before it, there were so many animated hero teams at the time, you know, because you had Thundercats, you had Silverhawks, like you said, you had G.I. Joe, which had a million characters, even more, you know, but it could be fleshed out later. Each character would get their own episode, you know, to explain their origin. But for right now, you know, this guy teleports, this girl shoots lasers out of her fingers. I don't know how, but she does, you know, like that kind of thing. You're just like, okay, we'll just accept it. I think it is strong in that way, but I just think the animation itself is so beautiful that's what I always come back to is I'm just like, man, all the danger room sequences are really cool. Like just seeing them use their powers for the first time, you're like, this is great. I love this.
I definitely thought it was the Australian invasion aspect that changed Wolverine's voice, because it was similar to, I don't know if the listeners remember, around 99 when suddenly everyone discovered Hawaii. Like Baywatch moves to Hawaii for like the tax cuts, and then all of a sudden there's an apostrophe in the name. They didn't teach us that in school, but it's like Hawaii or whatever. It was Hawaii on the brain at like Y2K time. So same thing there, Crocodile Dundee, the comics, they go to the Outback, so it makes sense. But like you're talking about the animation, I think it would have stayed on that level, because similar to when somebody makes like an indie comic, they pour all their like time and resources into number one, and they're not on a schedule, and then they can't pace themselves for like 2 and 3. In this situation, they didn't have a ton of money to work with. They actually used the budget that was slated for a 13th episode of RoboCop the Animated Series. So it's like, maybe it had a little more to it if it was expected to be like a finale or something, but ultimately it was a run-of-the-mill animated budget, you know? So like, I think they could have been consistent with that kind of budget going for them, you know, because RoboCop didn't have a ton of money in it, you know.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too. I think another reason that you're probably right that the animation would have stayed as on track as it was is, according to this Marvel Age report, they say, incidentally, it's worth mentioning that the animators at Toei described the X-Men as the best animation project they'd ever seen from America. So much so that they did 65 retakes out of their own pocket just to pull off some of the trickier shots. So popular have the mutants become, Toei's head animators have reportedly started collecting all the X-Men material they can find. So like the animation studio itself was now invested in this product. They fell in love with the characters and the story. So yeah, they probably would have done their best to keep putting out a good product, which I do want to say too. I always say like anime is not really my style. It's not something I enjoy, but the westernized anime style that, like you said, Sunbow creator and all of that always appeals to me. Like that's what I think is like superb animation of the era. So yeah, that's a great factor. I want to ask you though, of the voice actors, do you have a favorite performance?
That's a good question because like it's actually in my notes where I thought they had an amazing voice cast like across the board. But the thing that stood out to me was Michael Bell is great for Cyclops, but I don't think he would have worked for Scott Summers, if that makes sense. You
Huh.
know, like they're the same guy, but they've got different attitudes. So like in costume Cyclops, I got that like Michael Bell Duke. He's the leader, he's taking charge, but I don't know if he could have done soft-spoken Scott Summers. So he's the one I walked away with. I think Kitty Pryde is effective, but she also sounds like every kind of pseudo whiny teenage girl from an early 90s cartoon. Like if you look at the credits, they're probably like Kath Soucie or somebody, because like that was her bread and butter back then.
Yeah, that's who it is. And yeah, she was on Gem. She would do all the voices
Yep.
of the little teenage girls. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. She brought what she was known for.
Yeah.
How about you?
I was really impressed with Neil Ross as Nightcrawler because, there's a running story throughout, which is a great, just little nuanced thing where Kitty is like terrified of Nightcrawler, right? Like she looks at him and she's just like, he's ugly, he's freakish. So every time he's trying to be kind to her, she recoils in horror, right? But he is so like, how are you doing? Like he's like the proto Gambit, right? Like he's real flirty, which is exactly how he was in the comics. And I felt like Neil Ross just brought 100% what you imagine in your brain. Like this is what Nightcrawler would sound like, and he portrays it so well. And the payoff is fantastic by the end. When he sacrifices himself almost, then Kitty's like, "Oh, you're so brave, you're so wonderful," type thing. I really got attached to him. Otherwise, I felt like Storm was really cool. I don't know if there's ever been a bad vocal performance for Storm in all the animated performances, because I always feel like they kind of nail it, the actresses that they find. But I just thought she was solid because I was half expecting it to sound really terrible. Like
Right, right. Really, like,
memory.
what do Africans sound like in 1988 when they
Yeah.
would have been putting this together? Like, Ernest Goes to Africa. It would have been like, really? Ooh. But no, like, I'm glad you mentioned Neil Ross because I noticed there is a sequence during like the final battle where I don't know if this came down to scheduling or if it was mixed inappropriately or whatever, but there is a sequence where Neil Ross is dubbed over Cyclops, and you can tell because a little bit of shipwreck comes out. I listened and I had to keep going back because I was like, that's not Michael Bell. I don't know if it was a scheduling thing, if they had to do like more ADR or something, but Neil Ross, I believe, was briefly Cyclops in that pilot.
And I will say, just as like a fun bit of trivia, like Pat Fraley is the voice of Pyro in this, but he is also the voice of Krang on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So it's always amazing to watch the careers of these voice actors, especially back then where it was like an even smaller community. But like Frank Welker, it's Frank Welker being Toad, right? He's just doing this voice, like that he did. Different, I always call it just different levels of Slimer. Slimer's
Yes.
like at 10, and then he would do all the others. He'd do Glomer on Punky Brewster's like an 8, and then just like you bring it down and down to get to Toad, who's like a 4 on that scale.
That's probably in like his offer letter. It's like, we're looking for a 7 on the Slimer scale. It's like, gotcha. I gotcha.
But even Skeletor, Alan Oppenheimer is the Blob. It's just like, what? All right. Well, is there anything else that you want to point out as a plus for the pilot before we move on?
Okay, this is really kind of like subtle. I don't know if people caught this, and like this is one of those things where I feel, oh, Will's woke or whatever. But like it was important to me that when the X-Men save the scientist family is black.
Yeah.
And the little girl is all about like, oh, you're so pretty, like, thank you for saving me. But the dad is like, stay away from us. And it was just really interesting to see the black guy being the bigot. Like, you don't see that too much. If you do, it's in like a production that's very skewed, like Medea Goes to Jail or something like that. But like this kind of like, I guess, mainstream sort of potentially Saturday morning cartoon, and it didn't play to easy trope. So that stood out to me where I was like, okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down here. It's like, because it's the hypocrisy of it. It's like, hey, don't you remember what you went through? That kind of deal. But also, like, I guess the last thing that I really liked was I like how Kitty doesn't instantly win over Wolverine at the end. Now, I don't know how they would have handled that, because in today's world, there would be a whole season-long arc of her like winning him over, and by the end of the season he's like her prototypical Jubilee, which is sacrilege because Jubilee is the second Kitty Pryde. But in that era, there would probably just be like little glimpses every now and then, like kind of how we thought Flint and Lady J were together, but it's never really overt. There would have been instances of like, well, I cooked the kid breakfast, but like they were never ever gonna be like besties over the run of that cartoon. But I still like that, like, he was still Wolverine till the end. It wasn't just like a Tanner moment where everybody has a group hug.
Well, that characterization, it's interesting to me because there are so many comic book creators, including those who worked on the X-Men, people like John Byrne, who are like, I don't like Wolverine necessarily. Like, I fought for him to be on the team, but he's kind of a jerk. Like, and everybody suddenly like put him up on this pedestal and made him the most popular character ever, but he's not a good guy necessarily the way we were writing him back in the day. Like, he always comes through in the end, but like, I just thought that was fascinating because yeah, the whole time he's giving Kitty just crap. Like, he won't let her have a moment of saying, oh, you did a good job or whatever. He's like, nope, she's not an X-Man. She's going to screw everything up. She's not trained. We don't want her here. Get her out. Whatever you're doing, Professor, we don't need her. Like that type of thing.
And he's not wrong.
Yeah.
Like, I get it's a cartoon and she's the insert for the audience, but it's irresponsible as hell. But they didn't even talk to her parents. Like, they're just like, okay, let's go to space, 14-year-old girl.
Yeah.
Like, that'll get you the subject of a 14-episode podcast these days, Like,
I mean, the last thing I'll just say is it's always welcome in Marvel animation to have Stan Lee as the narrator, because he was the narrator of Marvel Comics. Of course, he's going to be the narrator. And it brings the universe together because, he would do that on the Spider-Man cartoon. Hey there, true believers. Here's what's going on in this episode. Yeah. So, and he wasn't like narrating every action. He's literally just like, here's an introduction. Go for it. So
I'm going to go cash this check.
But yeah, so it's just, it feels like a Marvel product and you could feel the infusion. It wasn't just somebody buying a license and then saying, oh yeah, we're going to make some money off this. It was like, it was done with passion and love, which is very clear when you see the creative team behind it then goes on to create the 92 series because they're like, we really thought this could work. They see it through to the end. There's some great things about this pilot, but there might be a few things that you can take a look at and say, maybe we do have some jeers.
Boo! Boo! Boo!
The first one I just want to bring up, because we're comic book readers, because we're comic book fans, there's going to be these little nitpicky things. A lot of it like really is trying to stay true to the characters. But the first thing that comes up to me is Professor X, he can read people's minds. They have a conversation about that and he tells Kitty, oh, I never misuse my power, don't worry. But then to decipher Magneto's plan, he uses his powers and he says like, he can't hide his thoughts from me, this type of thing. Magneto is wearing his helmet. What we learn in the comics is Magneto wears the helmet, it's later in the 2000 film as well, to block out Professor X. So Professor X can't influence him or read his thoughts or anything like that. But in here, he goes right through the helmet because Magneto never takes it off. And that's like a huge plot point. That's how he figures out the entire plan and why they have to stop it. So for me, I was just like, oh, that's the one thing. However, maybe that wasn't established yet. There's a possibility.
Because I was about to say, I feel like there was a recent retcon that said that that wasn't true.
Oh.
Like, and I'm only saying that, like, I have avoided X-Men like the plague for the past 5 years because I am not on board with this whole, like, House of X, Powers of X thing. Like, it's not X-Men to me. They're not playing baseball. They're not at the school. Like, it's just crazy to me. But, like, I saw somewhere on some message board that, like, I think the helmet thing might have been retconned. But, like, to piggyback on what you're saying with Xavier's powers, they play fast and loose with them because it bothered me. I know it's necessary for like tension and dramatic pause, but he should have known Nightcrawler wasn't dead when he teleports into space. I feel like he would even know he's like unconscious, something like that. It wouldn't just be like, he is gone. It gives you that great beat and that great moment, but that's not how his powers work, you know? But like for me, the big thing, and I'm always thinking about like the behind the scenes production aspects, like I know they're on a budget, but a pet peeve of mine is when the opening credits of a pilot are comprised of footage from the pilot.
Yeah.
Because once you get to the scene, you've already seen that footage. So it's like ultimately you're getting 10% of the pilot in the credits. So like there's no shock. Sometimes you get a full pilot, sometimes you get a sizzle reel. Sometimes they share footage, sometimes they don't. But in my perfect situation, the opening credits will pull from the sizzle reel while the pilot would be untouched. So you're seeing different things. Like ultimately I saw Colossus transform twice, but it was the same transformation each time. There's just a theme song during one of them, you know? Like that's just me. And then the big one, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is that Magneto's plan makes no sense. And I get that this is for kids, and it's for like 90s kids where we were all dumb hopped up on blue raspberry, but like he's gonna redirect this comet to hit the Earth to wipe out humanity so mutants will rise. But there's a key point missing there. I don't know if it got cut in editing or what, but he needs to Noah's Ark the mutants off the Earth before the comet hits. He doesn't invite any mutants to Asteroid M. So what's gonna let them survive the impact that humans won't?
That should have been like White Queen's job on Earth while they're in space is gathering up all the mutants, putting them in an underground bunker to keep them safe. 100%. Yeah. Going back to the theme song, though, you mentioned, seeing Colossus transform and getting that preview. The theme song for this is written by Stan Lee.
The less we say about that, the better. This is not Stan's best work. Stan should have stolen some work from somebody for this.
I just, it's very repetitive, which makes it an earworm. It's like X-Men, X-Men, this is the day, so like that'll get you. But the rest of it, like the actual verses, to pillage, burn, and plunder. But there's one team that will not yield, the team that strikes like thunder. Like it's heavy metal lyrics, but it's not really performed that way, I guess. Like the theme is there in the words, but it just feels like, like we had so many cool, like electric guitar theme songs back in the day with synthesizers, if it's Mask, but like Thundercats had a great one. Like it just felt like we could have made it a little bit cooler.
Well, that's what you're saying, where like you can tell there's a lot of heart in it, but you can also tell like studio interference, because at the end of the day, this was what they called a program length commercial. This was designed to sell toys or comics or whatever. Like that X-Men, like that soundbite is perfect for the toy, the action figure commercial, as they're like crashing through that like wall that you can't actually buy. Like that was had those awesome like play set diorama things, and then eventually they say like set is not available in stores or something like that. Like it's totally built for that. But you're right, like tonally it's wrong because it packages the show like G.I. Joe with powers. It's not X-Men.
Yeah, and I do want to say too, like as far as the lineup goes, I think they pick some great characters to work with, but why is Dazzler there? That's always what I've asked in the video game of this. Like, I can see that maybe they were going to say, well, she is a pop star. So maybe they would tie it into like a gem type of thing in later episodes where she gets to perform concerts and they can have music and do cool stuff, like make it real MTV. Maybe that was the thought process, but I just feel like there's so many other female X-Men characters they could have used. Like, because Storm, you got to have Storm. She's awesome. She's been a team leader, but like Dazzler Dazzler just always, because she really does nothing in this episode. I think she like tries to calm down Kitty at one point to say Wolverine's not your enemy, even though he's giving you a hard time, but that's about it. She doesn't really help.
Well, you're right, but they were saying in that Marvel Age issue you were talking about that they were trying to pick this in like a specific point in continuity, and like by going by that, Dazzler had joined the team shortly before the period here. While she's not still on the team once Kitty joins, this is gonna sound terrible, but that's what Will is here for. He's the wild card. Dazzler was their diversity hire. They said they needed to balance the genders on the team. They needed another woman. And they said they thought about Jean Grey, but there's so much baggage attached to her that they went for Dazzler instead. But like with that in mind, I guess I have to ask you, who would you have slotted in otherwise? Because from that era, everybody is either laden with baggage or problematic. So I'd love to know who else you'd rather see in that spot.
Yeah, for example, around this time, Psylocke, I don't think she had quite become the ninja Psylocke yet. I think that was
she was still blind with her like psionic powers or whatever.
Yeah, so she's kind of like a duplicate in some way of like Jean Grey, Professor X, if you're going like psionic powers. So you're saying like, okay, Betsy Braddock, you're out. And then I understand what you're saying, like Rogue has problems, I guess, like because you have to explain her whole history as being a villain, or do you? She has kind of that 80s kind of punk rock look, but she was on the team. So I think she would have been a good pick, because like even if they had kind of doubled up on the cool hairstyles in that Marvel Age magazine, there is a model sheet, of the different possible designs for Storm, and they were considering her mohawk look like she has an X-Men 97 now, basically. So and they decided not to go that way.
Because I see you with Rogue, but I also feel she's too close in age to Kitty for it to work. Because what people forget, and is even more pronounced at that era, Rogue is only roughly 19. When she showed up as Anna Paquin in the movie, a lot of people didn't get that because she'd been drawn like voluptuously for so long, but like she's not an old character. So like if they're going by like pre-Outback era Rogue, like maybe she's a step stool between Kitty and Storm, but ultimately like I don't think you have to show her as a villain, but I do think you have to have the Miss Marvel flashback, because if that never factors in, Rogue's kind of like, she's still a powerful character in that she can like leech your powers, but I feel like you need the Miss Marvel package to make her interesting.
You're probably right. I mean, I guess Dazzler was just, the safest bet at this point, because she's kind of a nothing character. She's always around. She's always like, she had that series all throughout the 80s. She had her Marvel Super Special thing, and it was like going to be a movie and all this stuff. Like, they really thought Dazzler was a big deal, and people must have been buying the book, because I always find them in back issue bins, like this huge run of comics. But yeah, so I guess that's the way you have to go now. The last thing I did want to bring up is I don't know if every episode could have kept up this pace, because it is relentless. It is just action, action, action. It never slows down. Like I say, like we talk about, there's some talky scenes. Not really. They're like 20 seconds of talking, and then it's on to more action. So I was just, that it does feel a little bit oppressive at certain times where you're just like, okay, can I catch my breath? Because now we're on to this set piece and this set piece, and it just keeps going.
It's overloaded. It's top heavy because, for one thing, it doesn't need the Brotherhood. It could have been accomplished with like Magneto, like he doesn't have the acolytes yet, but like I feel most of the Brotherhood are wasted. Again, White Queen is brought in, her design is toned down for like standards and practices, but again, they said she was brought in because they needed a female on the bad guy team.
It's
like
awesome.
Who? Oh, yeah. Yeah, Mystique, which, yeah, true. And getting into the Mystique thing, because she was in Freedom Force with the Blob, another thing that kind of bothered me, it's too heavy with cast, but, like, it's overpowered. You don't need Blob and the Juggernaut. Like, you pick one. One dies or falls in battle, you replace him. You don't need both.
Well, especially when Juggernaut, they point out in the Marvel Age magazine, he's not even a mutant. But they're like, but we're willing to forgive it because he's, Professor X's stepbrother, which the voice actor is constantly saying, hey there, stepbrother.
Right,
Don't
right.
forget
right.
your stepbrother.
He sounds like that uncle that like is always kind of drunk, but like sometimes he's fun, but like you're really ready for him to go by the end of the weekend. Like,
Yeah. So yeah, it has its little problems here, but like you said, overall it's a strong pilot. It really does feel like maybe it was just slightly too late for the trend. Like you're saying, like a toy line that has comic, that has a cartoon series, that has all that. Well, they're kind of working backwards because now they're like, we have a comic book that we want to turn into a cartoon and a toy, and they didn't have the toys just yet. So it feels like it was just like maybe just out of order for how things were done back then. And by 89, it's Ninja Turtle time. And I don't know if anybody thought X-Men was going to be the next Ninja Turtles, but it ended up doing pretty well for itself.
this is neither a cheer nor a jeer, but I found it interesting because we're back to Wolverine again. They took the most liberties with Wolverine, and I find it interesting. I think I get why they did it, just for like simplification, but Wolverine's mutant power is his claw. He doesn't have a healing factor. He doesn't have like any of the Wolverine things. He's just his claws. That's like a triggering thing for me because I once almost got into a fight with like a third grader as to what are Wolverine's powers. I'm not gonna tell you how old I was at the time, but he was a third grader and he and his friends were arguing that like Wolverine's claws come out of his gloves. I'm like, no, you dumb little kid. Like they're in his skeleton. They gave him adamantium. His bones are covered with metal and it got heated. But like, it was interesting to me that like, had that kid only seen this, all he knows is Wolverine has claws. And it might have been hard to really like convey the healing factor and all that stuff. I just found it interesting. They're like, nope, we're going to take the easy way out. You see the claws? That's what he does.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although I will also say I'm so happy that it was his brown and orange look. Like that's my favorite Wolverine costume. So every time that is used in some form, I'm just like, oh, it's so great to see it for that brief moment, where it was the definitive look for the character.
Right. We haven't talked show doctors. Now, this is an interesting situation in that the show does get retooled and we end up with all those seasons of it after 92. But I was just curious going through all this and watching it, how would you have kept this incarnation going, or would you have wanted to?
Okay. I honestly think this was something they did on Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends a lot, especially in the later parts of the series, which is you just make it a cameo fest. So really, you're bringing in as many Marvel Universe characters, be they villain or hero. And it's just like the X-Men now is like the nexus, because in Marvel Comics, like as it's become now, it kind of feels like they've been insulated for a long time. And X-Men are kind of their own thing, and then there's everything else going on at Marvel. And that was especially the case in the 90s when I was really reading as well. So I feel like if that's what they did, and they just said, okay, number one, you're going to meet a lot more mutants as we introduce them. Here they are. Some are going to join the team. Oh, like there's these new mutants. Hey, there's some kid named Cannonball or whatever, so they start having these different groups. But especially, I think for comic book fans, but also just if you're looking to get a toy license, look at all the characters we have. Look who you could be using, and the kids are loving this one, the kids are loving that one. We're getting the most fan mail. For some reason, Doctor Strange is hitting hard. Everybody's into the mysticism. Okay, well, let's get a Doctor Strange toy in production. So I think that's where I would have taken it. Cameo heavy is the way to go.
I think for episode 10, this is maybe the first time we're on the same exact page for keeping a show together. We went to the same med school. We've got the same tactic to save this show. I agree with that. I don't think the team is too big, mainly because we've seen how big it could get. So for X-Men standards, I think this is a slim team, and I like it like this because I don't know if you're familiar. It only lasted like one season, but like the fans love it. There was a G.I. Joe reboot called G.I. Joe Renegades. It's from like the teens, and it was on the Hub back when like Hasbro tried to have their own channel. In that show, you have a very like skeleton crew of G.I. Joe members. We're talking like 5. It's like the ones you can name off the top of your head, like Duke, Snake Eyes, like Roadblock, because you gotta have the black guy with the gun, like all those guys. Every episode, though, there was like the Joe of the day. Because the theme of that show is they're on the run. They're basically the A-team, but they're the G.I. Joe characters we grew up with. So they're moving from town to town on the run from a Cobra, and they meet up with like, oh, here's an army specialist who's really good with computers. Or here's a canine officer who really has a great relationship with his dog. That kind of thing. It's like, oh, that's Mutton Junkyard. Oh, that's that guy. So like I'd love to do that with X-Men, because I feel like even the 92 cartoon didn't lean heavily into that. Like they would meet someone we're familiar with, you're like, oh, finally Colossus, and then he's gone. Like nobody joined the team. They like met him. They were like, okay, we're cool. If you need me, call me. And then we like never saw him again. So like, I like the idea of kind of like making it cameo heavy, especially in this era. One thing that shocked me, I've been going back reading, like we're talking like early 80s Marvel. And I read like Phoenix Resurrection. When Jean Grey comes back as the Phoenix, her body is found by the Fantastic Four, like under like Hudson Bay, like in this cocoon or whatever. And they call the X-Men, but like they're not familiar with each other. Like we read comics now and it's like, oh yeah, hey Cap, how's it going? But back then it's kind of like, hi Miss Grey, you may remember us from that battle a few months ago. So it's like, I want to see those interactions, not that they're comfortable with each other, but them meeting and trying to see if they gel and getting acquainted with each other. Yeah, cameo heavy. But that kind of segues into, we have to think about, okay, if we had done this and the show had succeeded, then how does that change things in a segment we call What Might Have Been?
No, we'll never know. What might have been.
Let's say it gets picked up 1 season, 2 seasons, it's going into 1991. So obviously you're going to get a toy line out of it. And they were already aiming for that. Avi Rod 1990 with Toy Biz gets a whole line of Marvel. He's launching the X-Men. There's this big ad for X-Men action figures based on the comics, not based on this pilot. Definitely see like a little X Factor influence in there, like other versions of the characters. Is it Toy Biz? Probably, because that's how history played out. But maybe Marvel would have gone back to Mattel because they did the Secret Wars thing. I see that happening. And then I see the characters like gaining some momentum. But because this animation style was on the way out, I feel like then it fizzles by 91. And then now all of a sudden, Jim Lee is drawing the X-Men. He's revamped them. They look so cool. Well, look at these old models and look at this old animation. It looks like the 80s. We're in the 90s now. And I think it just fades away and X-Men suddenly become, I kind of remember that one. And then you're just like, oh man, missed opportunity. It's like if they pushed it through, they got what they wanted in the moment, but in the long run, they blew it.
Exactly. I'm completely on board with you there because like you were saying, animation is changing at that point. We're getting into the whole, like, you needed a cause or a message. We're getting into Captain Planet. We're getting into like G.I. Joe as the eco warriors and the drug elimination force. Like you needed that hot button issue that like got you a very special episode. And like X-Men as a concept is a very special episode if you lean heavy into it. But it's like you're saying, even as a quote unquote success, it really wouldn't have had staying power. When you go back to that era, we're looking at like the real Ghostbusters, Garfield and Friends, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as far as things that had like legs to them. Ghostbusters and Garfield got 7 seasons each, and then Turtles got 10. Even G.I. Joe is technically 2 different shows. It's the Sunbow and it's the Deke, and they're under the same banner, but like they don't have the same quality, they don't have the same characters, there's no continuity there. So even as a success, it's like you're saying, it doesn't line up because you don't really have the corporate synergy that you have now. So like it would have bumped against the Jim Lee incarnation. We wouldn't have gotten X-Men 92. Maybe we would have gotten it in 94, but would it have carried as much weight? Like it had to ride the wave of the Jim Lee era. And like he was really only on that book like a year, So it's like we forget about that. Like we love like, oh, Jim Lee kicked Chris Claremont out of X-Men, but he really didn't stay too long. So like with that in mind, I think is probably for the best that it didn't go anywhere. Everything happened as it should have.
Yeah, even if it was somehow revered because of the messages, maybe it wins some awards, some sort of Emmy, like, I don't know, for children's programming, because maybe in the scripts they are able to touch on these themes that, the 92 series later does. I almost feel like, yeah, you get 2 seasons with Sunbow, and following the G.I. Joe model, Deke takes it over for like a 3rd season and makes it ridiculous and just like
cheaper.
Yeah,
it'll look like it too,
Yeah.
And like even if we shift the timeline, maybe we get the 92 show in the place of Evolution around like 97. But like, does anybody count Evolution anyway? Like we're in a world now where they turn reboots around quickly. Ben 10 came out when I was probably like 20, and it's been in 3 different incarnations. Long incarnations. But like, there was more time between that back then if they dared to do it at all. Maybe it happens, but it's just not part of the zeitgeist.
Yeah. And I think too, because if all these people that are working on it then have that success, then we don't get Spider-Man, the animated series, just a few years later. Like we don't get that kind of whole universe of Marvel animation that they were really building up. Now, X-Men and Spider-Man are really the only good ones. Like
I was ready to say, like, is that a loss? It's not like if Bruce Timm doesn't end up at Warner Brothers, we'll probably get to it, but I'm no fan of the Spider-Man animated series, so if the buck stopped at X-Men, I'm fine over here.
Well, real quick, as we close out, because again, if we don't get X-Men 92, we don't get X-Men 97 that just dropped. And so just general thoughts. How do you feel about what X-Men 97 has done in comparison to the original series? And is it carrying the same spirit? Do you feel like it carries, the same weight, than it was in the 90s when it was doing?
Yeah, like I was saying before we started, like I've watched 3 X-Men pilots this week because I watched Pryde and then I watched 97 and then I looped back around to watch Night of the Sentinels just to kind of like get the pacing and everything. And it dropped. We got the first 2 episodes of 97. And I will tell you, I appreciated the second episode so much more than the first. Like, the first is kind of like, why are we doing this? It's the complete same spirit to the point of, like, they're doing nothing. Like, the things that are new are annoying. Like, on down to the theme song. It's like you had a perfect theme song. You didn't need to remaster it. Like, that's felt like one of those things where, like, they didn't want to pay the artists from the first recording, Because there's an updated theme song, but it's still the one we know and love. You know what it is? And I hope most of our audience gets this because I think I know who they are. It is Weezer's cover of Toto's Africa. It is note for note X-Men 92. But it's like, why? Like, watching the first episode, I'm kind of like, I would have rather had an update or a reimagining using the same ingredients. We didn't need to start from where that one ended. But then you get to the second episode and it starts to move things forward. And I'm like, okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down. I think this season is promising. It has the same like episodic nature as the old show. It's not like a done-in-one situation. They're going to be arcs, but they're still pretty much the characters you remember and love. I'll say this one thing. This is not like a spoiler or anything, but it ties into what we discussed earlier. The same way I said Michael Bell was a good Cyclops, but probably wouldn't have been a good Scott Summers. In this show, the guy who's Cyclops, I don't know his name because I know the original voice actor passed away a few years ago. I watched Night of the Sentinels right afterwards. So the new guy does a really capable job of imitating him. However, if you close your eyes, you realize that Cyclops is really just Chris Parnell doing the Jerry voice from Rick and Morty being serious. Not that Jerry is like, come on, can I borrow a few bucks? But like Jerry, when like he's down to earth and he realizes like, oh, he's losing his family and it's time to man up. That's who Cyclops is. And that's kind of jarring. So I probably just either made a few people want to check this out or maybe ruined it for some people. But that was my takeaway from the first 2 episodes. So taken together, it's a very promising start.
Well, for people like me who don't watch Rick and Morty, it will not be jarring in any way, even though I love Chris Parnell, so now I want to check it out. But I do want to say that for me, like that first episode, I think 100% they knew what they were doing. Fan service right off the bat. Give everybody what they're expecting. Don't change the formula, like you said. Keep it exactly like you remember and just like make you feel the nostalgia. And then we're going to switch it up right at the end and learn, oh, things have changed now. Because, okay, Professor X is dead. Magneto's taken over. All right, now where do we go from there? How does that affect all the characters we know? How would they react at this point in time? So that worked really, really well for me. There was like a ton of action in the first episode and then a lot of talking in the second episode, but really poignant talking in the second episode. And so you're like, okay, so it is slightly more adult, just like the series was slightly more adult in 92 than what kids programming had been at that point, which is why it stood out and why it connected with so many people. So I was just very excited by it. And I guess my biggest compliment I can give to X-Men 97 is to say it is the quality of show I thought I was getting in 92. That I'm not saying the 92 series is terrible, but the animation always bothered me. And the quality of animation now, it is so beautiful, but very reminiscent, but not 100% recreating what I did not like about the 92 series. So it's just like, oh, fluid animation that looks great. And the vocal performances are good and the writing is good. So yeah, overall, I was so satisfied. And the only other little thing I want to put in is that I know when the trailer dropped, everybody's like, Wolverine doesn't sound like Wolverine. I thought they got the original guy back. And because it was just one line that he said, right? And he's not gruff, he's not growly. But then when you watch the episode, he's 100% the same Wolverine he always was. But that one line, for whatever reason, he drops the gravel. And you're like, why did they pick that one? To throw us all off? Like to get us talking? Like, it's so weird.
See, I love this because like we find people come at things different ways. I will say I didn't like the animation. I found it jarring because I'm one of those people who feels like Marvel can't do animation. They started doing those direct-to-DVD things the same time DC did. I don't know if DC got the better animators on their team, but like if you go back and watch Ultimate Avengers, which is their like animated adaptation of the Ultimates comic series, the animation is very like stilted and people don't move right. And I felt the same way here. Like even watching Night of the Sentinels afterwards, I know it's older and it hasn't aged well. I thought the character models and the movement were so much easier to digest and accept than I did from 97. Also, with Wolverine's voice, I was tricked because I had no problem with him not being gruff in that line, but I felt that throughout the first episode, he sounds like a member of Death Clock. Like, he's really overdoing the growl. And I'm just like, this is not Metalocalypse. That's not what I'm here for.
Well, I loved it. So I think it's going to be very cool to see how the series progresses and where they take it from here. But speaking of that, where are we going to take it from here, Will? Well, next time around, we're going to have our first guest on the podcast. Yes, Chad Young from Horror Movie Barbecue. We met up at RetroCon. We had a conversation, and he wants to talk to us about 80s pro wrestling sitcom Learning the Ropes, starring Lyle Alzado. So this is going to be a very, very interesting conversation. I don't know if we'll get to any of our segments knowing Chad, but we'll do our best.
There are episodes of podcasts I recorded with Chad that never saw the light of day because they got so off the rails. He's like, yeah, I don't know where I can put that out. So, like, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that because it's going to be all over the place. But thank you so much for checking out this episode and this conversation. 10 episodes in, Will, and we're still enjoying ourselves. This experiment has gone well. But speaking of going well, I've enjoyed a couple of your blog posts recently, especially one where you were talking about the different media sharing apps from back in the 90s that were controversial and maybe reminding people how it really was. And it was just very detailed. So where can people find that and other recent posts from you?
You can find me at my website, westweekever.com. I was actually really prolific this week. So there's the post Adam was talking about like old-timey file sharing. I did a post recapping Awesome Con, which was a pop culture con here in DC a few weeks ago. So yeah, it's been a big week. But every Friday I do West Week Ever Pop Culture in Review, where we look at the week that was in popular culture. I'm on social media everywhere at William B. West.
All right. You can find me on social media at Hoju Coolander. But if you want to see what I'm putting out in terms of podcasts, you can go to the retronetwork.com, the home of Geekster, where I just released a new podcast. How many can I cram into 2024? We'll see. But this one is called the Geekster Geek Out podcast, where we bring on interesting individuals who are known for their over-the-top, well, not necessarily over-the-top, but prolific fandom. Let's put it that way. And we say, but what do you never get to talk about? What is the thing that is also one of your great interests that nobody ever comes to you and asks you to guest on their podcast to talk about? And so we give them a forum, and our first episode was a great success. People loved it. We talked to Sean Robert. Normally people talk to him about the Monster Squad, but he wanted to talk about lunchboxes. And we got into some fascinating history, some nostalgia, and an 80s property that never was. Like early 90s, I don't know what this thing was, but it was on a lunchbox and he found it and he did some research. Like, that's my tease. Go find the episode just for that, because there is something somebody was trying to sell. Maybe there's a pilot out there. Maybe we'll get to cover it someday. But for now, just check out the Geek Out podcast on your favorite podcast app. But anyway, thanks so much for checking out this edition of Remember That Show. And until next time, we're changing the channel.
This has been a presentation of Geekster Media.